I'm shocked.
Come on in.
Reality is the universe humping itself. I don't know what you'd say. Scientific theology, the male-female duality um, seems to be an aspect of reality, not just something that we impose like an anthropomorphic, concept on reality. It's actually coming from reality that we're getting these notions, even beyond biological. The physical universe, you can see the same duality.
Pathology of social structures and the danger of everything that we don't understand. And so those are two of the major things that people have to manage in life, archetypally speaking, universally speaking. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the whole point of writing a book.
The Maps of Meaning. I haven't read any of his books. I've watched all his lectures and such. So I know the shape of a lot of it, but I would like to see it when it's laid down in the, more formal book structure. Semantic reduction of, the information is remarkable. His ability to distill what is essential in the systems that he's living, that we experience as being human, is incredible. I've spent most of my adult life like lusting after finding people who're smarter than me. That's what intellectual, discourse. That's what I look for. It's like there are so few people out there that is like you can actually ask them something and do something with what you get back. And these two.
Writing is a protracted form of thinking, and the advantage to writing as thinking is that writing makes you smarter than you are without the paper and pencil or without the computer, especially the computer, because the computer can enable you to edit. Editing has become effortless in some sense. Back when you used paper and pencil, there was a tremendous amount of labor involved in editing. Not just mental labor, obviously, reconfiguring the ideas, but actual muscular energy. Or even with a typewriter, it was very difficult to produce sequential drafts. You have to retype whole pages or it would become an unreadable mess. But with a computer, you can incrementally improve indefinitely. And so you can have a very long discussion with yourself. And I took full advantage of that when I wrote Maps of Meaning.
Yeah, I totally agree with what he's saying about.
I was trying to account for
writing technology. In graphic, my background is more in graphic arts than the writing side of it, though I do that too. I can't draw. So I took drafting in high school, and we had an actual professional level graphic arts shop, gone from complete old school graphic arts with, film and cameras and arc burners and plates and, lead type, through the whole transition to completely digital world. And he's right. I mean, any kind of editing of anything in some ways it's a handicap because you had to have your ducks in a row before you started, before you started writing the sentence. On the other hand, getting to type it out and then redo it and redo it and redo it and redo it and redo it is very helpful. So it's kind of a, blessing and a curse at the same time, the modern way of editing with digital. So he's exactly right on how powerful it is. He just hasn't mentioned that it's also a handicap because now you don't think it that far through before you already, you're already spouting your trap. You're already flapping your trap before you really have your thoughts in a row.
Malevolence of the genocidal sort, I suppose, at the individual level, motivation for genocide. And then to also try to outline how that might be avoided, given that it's a pronounced human propensity, far more pronounced than we like to admit. And I spent 15 years thinking about that. And that was Maps of Meaning. It's a very difficult book. It was difficult to write. I found it difficult to read when I've reread it. There are chapters that I really have to think hard about to fully understand, even though I wrote them. It's because I stretched myself to my intellectual limits maybe beyond in some ways. Many of the ideas that I developed in 12 Rules for Life and in Beyond Order stem from maps of meaning. So, and certainly much of what I've done in my career as a lecturer owes its success to the 15 years of 3-hour days, roughly speaking, that I put in on that book. And so it was an unbelievably useful exercise.
I think it's quite amazing that he was able to articulate all that stuff and get it out without I mean, he studied this for so long, and the picture, the model, the machine that he's built in his head, he hasn't found any reason to replace the camshaft, redesign, the transmission, put a different kind of radiator system on it. It's just been a lot refining, tweaking, tuning, and he's still working with the same pattern, and it still satisfies. And that's one of the things why I keep coming back to him, is even though, he's not perfect, he doesn't have all the information, but what he has, he trusts. He understands what he does have. He's been over the ground enough himself that he believes in it, so it's going to be a natural progression. His later work should never contradict his earlier work, the way he worked. With some philosophers, it's like you've got different periods of their life where they end up flatly contradicting themselves. He doesn't do that because he's tries to be as sure as he can of what he has at foundation before he moves on. So he's able to just keep building, because there's no rotten core of self-delusion that most academic professionals have. In fact, it's almost a requirement that you have some sort of, if he has anything, it's just that he can't know anything. He can't know everything. That's his weak core, is he can't know everything. And he has to come to some sort of conclusions with the data he does have. So, but he's also aware of that. He is self-aware of his own propensity for error. So he doesn't make the statements that he can't back up. I feel a lot of kinship with the way he thinks, the way he parses it out, and his assurance and why he's sure of himself.
My very first evolutionary project, when I was an undergraduate working with Bob Trivers, I did a project in which I analyzed the Holocaust through an evolutionary lens and effectively reached the conclusion that that Hitler was a monster, but that he was a rational monster, and that it is very important for us to understand what that means, that this was too easily dismissed as insanity rather than depravity of a recognizable kind.
It's important to give the devil his due.
I agree 100%. The problem is it is so hard to do. It's very hard to face up to the level of possibilities on both sides of the spectrum for human beings. We have trouble embracing the heights and the depths that we're capable of. I think part of it's because if we embrace that, then we're responsible for doing it or not doing it. If we don't believe it, then when it happens, we can kind of go, not my fault. That also means we don't take credit when we do it right.
You risk failing to understand it. You think of it as a one-off in some sense. And that may be true, although it's not as if genocidal acts are one-offs. They're very common, unfortunately. You can make a strong case that there was something particularly egregious about the Holocaust, although there were 20th century catastrophes that were arguably of comparable horror, if you want to dare to compare horrors. But
in some ways, it's like there's a strong temptation, and I think in some ways a need to link the Nazi and the Soviet horrors and the Soviet. Basically, the communist as well as the fascist horrors, they all were. It was a simultaneous thing. It was just two different facets of the same thing, coupled with, for the first time in history, industrialized means. We had gunpowder, we had machines, we had planes, and going at the same old business produced something that was different in magnitude, but not kind. But like I was saying, the complex systems produce emergent properties. the new horror of that century was an emergent property of all this stuff. Nothing new, just it got so big that a whole different realm manifested itself.
Terrible things happened in Maoist China and in Cambodia and in the Soviet Union. And perhaps all of that wasn't undertaken with the blood-curdling efficiency of the Third Reich. That's part of what makes that story uniquely horrible. But I agree with you that...
Very interesting point of the East versus West. The only real difference I see is the East versus West mentality of the people carrying it out. They were doing the same exact thing. It's just where he sees in the West is the more individual. Despite the depersonalization of the Holocaust, they were terrified and tortured and tormented as individuals who were part of a group. They were not just a faceless. It's the passionless horrors produced by the Japanese and the Chinese and the Cambodians. It was just, they weren't all like bloodthirsty, It was just like, casual, dismissive. This group goes, and the individuals didn't exist. That to me that makes the Eastern ones worse, because they were so more just implacable. It was a steel wall coming at you that didn't give a damn. Whereas the German deviations, they were personal. It was all personal, very personal to everybody, because it was about individuals still. It was still Western. So I disagree with him on that point.
Mythology is not very helpful, especially when you think that there was a whole country involved, and more than that, really. So
yes, I think I do think there was something special about the Third Reich, but it was a variation on a theme that is much less unique. And that, in some sense, is now a problem because, in my opinion, the only way to prevent these things from continuing to happen is to understand what it is in human nature that causes them. And that, in fact, all right, let's start with the dangerous argument, shall we?
God, yeah.
Here, let me talk by analogy. Let us just say that all of us, because for many reasons, are likely the descendants of women who were raped at some point in history, and we likely all carry the genetic capacity to engage in it as a result. But most men that I spend time with, I believe, are actually not capable of this. And they're not incapable of it because they're genetically incapable. They're incapable of it because development took that option off the table. And that there are a great many things in human nature that are like this. Things that when we are born, the capacity exists, and then a proper upbringing and an environment that does not reinforce these things, or better, makes them disgusting to us, takes them off the list of possibilities. And I believe that genocide...
Let me add something to that, Tim.
Please.
You tell me what you think. Well, there's two things I think that take it off the table. One might be developmental history. And so you might say that there could be a biological tendency. And if it isn't encouraged, reinforced, or even if it's punished out of existence through inattention, even, I won't pay attention to you if you do that, or I'll punish you outright if you do it one way or another. It can't develop. But then I would also say that in a functioning society, the eliciting conditions for that behavior are also unlikely to arise. I mean, you see mass rape very frequently in wartime. And it is quite unlike normal male sexual behavior in the context of an intimate relationship, partly because it's often at least somewhat public, which makes it unique, because sexual activity among intimate partners is generally private, but in wartime it can be public. And so I would say that we protect ourselves against that biological propensity, that genetic propensity, partly through socialization, by bringing aggression under control, especially in its sexual elements, but also by structuring our society so that we never allow ourselves to go somewhere where those motivations are likely to emerge, and also where they wouldn't be immediately punished out of existence. But that can happen. And I think you see those sorts of things happen in the midst of riots, for example, where a law-abiding person, a generally law-abiding person, will get caught up in the chaotic frenzy and find themselves doing things that they had perhaps never done before. I would like to think that it's a matter of socialization and a matter of regulation by conscience, but I do think that a fair bit of it is also brought under control by the stability and relative benevolence of the social surround.
Well, I think those two things obviously fit well together.
Now, let me give you an example.
Sure.
From the chimps. So chimps, especially the adolescent males, will go on what are essentially border patrol. They'll patrol the borders of their territories, and there's usually a couple of them, 3, 4, 5, a small group, and sometimes a female or two, but generally adolescent males. If they come across a male chimp from another troop, or it could be one or a couple, they have to outnumber them generally. They'll often react extremely aggressively, and really aggression without control. So chimps are hunters, and they'll hunt colobus monkeys, for example, which are about 40 pounds, if I remember correctly. And they tear them from limb to limb, and sometimes they'll eat them when they're alive, and they're screaming away, and that doesn't inhibit them. And then when they attack foreign chimps, there also doesn't seem to be any inhibition of aggression whatsoever. It's there in its full array. But in their own troops, they engage in dominance disputes, and those will often escalate, but the rest of the troop gets upset and tends to regulate it. And so it's looking at that sort of thing that makes me afraid that it isn't so much socialization as it is our attempt to ensure that we always maintain ourselves in peaceful circumstances and we never depart from those places, not if we can help it. So hopefully socialization also matters.
Well, I would argue that these two things work together, that you have a very dangerous possibility, and that by reducing the amount of flammable material around and reducing the care with which one plays with the flame, the likelihood of a fire out of control is reduced. And that if you take away either one of these things, it goes up spectacularly. With respect to the question of rape, I would say you have the added feature that in order for a man to rape a woman, he has to be turned on.
That's where I would stop. To me, it's inconceivable how anyone who doesn't have a brain that's twisted into a pretzel somehow could possibly climax while forcing another individual human to be doing this. It's like, you can't, how do you put the two together? It's just that this equation there is no middle ground. There is no overlap in the Overton windows. And I don't know how much of that's genetic or socialized. To me, it just feels like that's core. I mean, I cannot imagine how you would, with some sort of like Zen-like mantra to like disengage from what's happening and let your body do it. I mean, how would it even be possible?
Grown up as a boy in an environment that caused the idea of rape to become disgusting to him will not be capable of the act, hopefully. So we don't have that in the case of something like genocide. I believe we do need to make all of the various thought processes that result in warfare and genocide disgusting, so that people do not engage in these behaviors. And, if we don't, I suspect we will see exactly what we are seeing now, which is people playing with the very tropes that create this impulse, not realizing that in some sense there is a program latent within humans that, when activated, creates exactly the discontinuous kind of behavior that you see in chimpanzees when they encounter rival males. Right?
Well, and I think in the human case, it's actually the chimp analogy is pretty brutal, but chimpanzees are certainly exceeded in their capacity for brutality by human beings. And that's partly because, I think it's partly because, it took me a long time to think this through, and I do outline it in all three of my books. There's a scene in Genesis where people become self-conscious, their eyes are open, and virtually at the same time, so the story goes, they become capable of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's a very mysterious story, but after thinking about it literally for a decade or so, I started to understand, I think, that it's a story about, so what happens is people become self-conscious, they become aware of their nakedness, and they become aware of good and evil. They also become aware of they're destined to work.
What they do is, it's like quantum physics. While they were in the garden, they were virtual, and there were no consequences. They were real, but they weren't real. With the apple, with the awakening, they noticed themselves, just as virtual particles, once they are noticed, they can't be virtual anymore. And Adam and Eve became real. I mean, it's fun if you know relativity and quantum physics, and you go back and read Genesis, you can have so much fun with the idea that somebody saw visions of true intuition with no clue what in the hell they were seeing. So they had no reference, nowhere to hook it. And so they wrote a story down about this dream, this thought. But they were seeing something real. And we can go back and look at, Genesis has some amazing things to look at if you look at it from our perspective back that way.
Beings, if you think about it as delay of gratification, conscious delay of gratification, I'll give up something now, which is a sacrifice, in order to obtain something of more value in the future. That's one of the outstanding discoveries of humankind. The emphasis on sacrifice in the Old Testament, for example, I think is a historical portrayal, a quasi-historical portrayal of the emergence of the idea of sacrifice, which I believe was first acted out before it was understood psychologically or explicitly. So you imagine, I do think in an evolutionary manner, and I take seriously the fact that life has been around for 3.5 billion years, and that there's been mammals for 60 million, and it's been 7 or 8 since we split from our shared ancestor with chimps. That's a very long period of time. Over that period of time, human beings realized that they could let go of something in the present and gain something in the future. And there's no way, you don't leap from the complete lack of knowledge of that fact among chimpanzees to the explicit ability to state it as a set of propositions without an insanely long developmental history in between those 2 points. And human beings learned over time that those who let go in the present, at least under some conditions, were much more likely to be popular, let's say, with their peers. Because if I'm a hunter, for example, I could share with you and store up my goods in the form of the favor that you now owed me, which is an extremely effective way of storing food, and a very strange way of storing it. We learned over time that people who were able to do that were more likely to survive. They made better mates. And after that, only long after that, were we able to derive that as a principle. Anyways, back to having our eyes opened. When we became self-conscious, we became aware of the future. Along with our awareness of the future came awareness of our own fundamental mortality and fragility, because that's associated with the discovery of the future. That also enabled us to put things off until the future.
This goes back again, the reality thing. Virtual particles don't do anything. They're completely free. They can be anything. They're not here, there, but they don't do anything. They don't matter, so to speak. Same thing with interaction with people. You can go live on a hillside and stuff, but you don't matter if you don't interact. It's a sacrifice. You have to give up all this option and limit this. Say, I'm going to give that up. He's putting it in human historical terms, but I think it goes even deeper than that. It's more of an existential. This is like part of the built-in reality.
The thing about human beings that makes us so unbelievably vicious is that once I'm aware of my own fragility, deeply aware of that, I can capitalize on that because I can understand that what will hurt me will also hurt you. And that means I can start to make an art out of pain. Animals, at their worst, they're predatory in a brutal manner. But human beings go way past that in their capacity for destruction.
I agree on both points. I've watched a cat watching two squirrels playing in an oak tree that was hanging over someone's driveway in New Orleans one day. And that cat was just frozen on the lawn watching them. And they're just darting back and forth, darting back and forth, and darting back and forth. And it was waiting for one of them to fall. When one did, before it hit the ground, that cat was moving. And before it got back to its feet, it had it by the back of the neck, one twitch, it was dead. It was over in a second and a half. Squirrel fell, hit the ground, it was dead. The cat knew exactly what it was waiting for. And humans take our intelligence and add it to that. So definitely agree on both points.
Aware of our own fragility, and so can artfully use that awareness on others. It's also that we have motivations that animals don't have too, like very complex motivations of revenge and resentment. And they're very, very, very dark motivations. And I think part of the reason it's so difficult for us to understand our own behavior in relationship to events like the Holocaust is that to really understand that, you have to look in places that are so dark that looking there is in itself virtually traumatic.
Come on in. Extreme simplification. That's like a grammar school level of explanation. I am back. Simplified to the point of lying. The refraction is dependent on the gas, the composition, the temperature at the time, the angles. It's that is simplified to the point of lying. He's completely overlooking the fact that we have a molten core and a magnetic field, but the molten core that is balancing out, and I doubt he will get at any point mention the multi-million, billion-year history, the glaciations that appeared at a certain point and have been getting more and more frequent because the damn planet's cooling off inside. That's not even part of his equation. Water vapor is more significant greenhouse vapor. A sudden change higher up would be, but the composition of the whole atmosphere, I don't know. I would want to see some data around that before I would accept that. He just pole vaulted over a whole bunch of detail between those two times to do that. He just ignored the whole thing. Do you know how long it took the Industrial Revolution to actually produce enough CO2 to be significant? Very recently. But they're talking about effects going back to the Industrial Revolution. It was a breath of a trace in somebody's fart at the time, as far as the globe was concerned. It was only until the 20th century that we got off, late 18th century, 20th century, that we really started dumping a lot of stuff. Because that's when we started using fossil fuels instead of, wood for a lot of stuff. And so we started driving the level back up again. And I say, hallelujah. There are pages in that could of supposition, speculation, if, maybe, could be's. I mean, that is, there's a volume of crap buried in that could. That's an assumption that is not supported by any evidence that I know of. Even their worst case scenarios, which are way out of line, the Dutch could handle it. In the course of time, over the next 100 years, the Dutch could handle it. And everybody else could handle it. They would hardly notice the changes, really, over a single lifetime. It would just be like, oh, okay, yeah, when I was a kid, that was, over there instead of on this side of the street. And it would not make a big deal. On the other hand, having the CO2, they never talk about any of the reason why we have it. It's that fence law again. The CO2 is there. There's a reason why it's there. Before we go thinking we should get rid of it, why don't we look at what it's doing? All they do is talk about reasons, mostly imaginary, for why we should get rid of it, and utterly blind to why it was put there, so to speak. Why did God put it there if it's not supposed to be there? We didn't do it. Humans are the devil. God put the CO2 there. If you are running a school and you've got rampant robberies, burglaries, muggings, all this stuff, do you really think that going zero tolerance on having your proper pencil case with you in class is going to do any good for anybody? Quibbling over nothing, minor things to nothing, when there are real issues they could be wasting that energy on. Fine with letting all that stuff go. We can, the water vapor, that could kill. If we're going to go into catastrophic, greenhouse effect, water vapor could do it to us, and there ain't shit we can do about it. Well, hell, damn, let's regulate this, which isn't going to, if we go over the edge, that's not going to be what does it. And there is no edge to go over. They're constantly framing a threat where there is no threat and ignoring all of the reasons why the damn fence was there in the first place, which is incredibly complex, cyclic, and we don't understand it in any level of detail. What we do understand is dumping just CO2 into it ain't going to hurt anybody except some moron who just bought a multi-million-dollar oceanfront property and wants to leave it to their grandkids unaltered. That's it. It's fear mongering. One of the things that they were talking about was we're coming to great understanding of people, why we do things. The problem with gaining that understanding is before we've gained enough understanding to be wise, we gain enough understanding to exert control. And I think that's what you're seeing happening now is all that stuff is accumulating, and we've learned back in the early 20th century the basics of mob control, how to deal with humans as mobs. And it's not pretty, and it's too easy. And they've been practicing it, everybody who wants to practice it has been. And it's coming, basically, this is the year when all the propaganda comes to fruit. They finally, it's finally getting, everything in the groove of control. This is all about controlling information to control the people.
People don't, and I understand why, but I don't think we have that luxury, unfortunately.
I would say that exactly. We don't have the luxury. And it's not that everybody needs to look deeply into those dark places, but we need to agree that it has to be done, that people who are capable of figuring out what's there have to be licensed to do it, and we have to avoid demonizing them for thinking about it and discussing it. But I want to go back a little bit. A lot of what you say resonates with me here. I suspect the answer with respect to what animals do and don't do is more nuanced than you're thinking. So, for example, I can easily come up with several examples from various species of what appears to be an impulse toward delayed gratification. I don't think.
Oh, I know it's there in its nascent form, and you certainly see it acted out. I don't.
The cat knew that it could try to jump at it, but no, wait for one to fall, and you'll have dinner. Right, dinner is served.
Insects like bees, for example, it's built into beavers. I think you see instinctual. There's instincts that mimic delay of gratification, and I do think it's there in its nascent form. Like languages, for example, in chimpanzees, they can get some distance with language, although not very far. There's virtually nothing that you see in human beings that you can't see echoes of in other animals. But at some point, a difference in quantity, say, makes a difference in quality, and the self-conscious emotions are developed to a very high degree. You see elephants, for example,
Emergent properties.
from what I've been able to understand, they do return. I think there are reliable reports of them returning to places where a close relative of theirs had died and moving the bones and that sort of thing. And they seem to grieve. And I've seen grief in my pets, or what it certainly appears to be grief. But, you know, the certain knowledge that your life is finite and so is everyone else's, that seems to me to be uniquely human. And it's certainly uniquely human to be able to state it as an explicit proposition.
Yes, I think that's very frequently where the line is. There's no question in my mind that we have clear evidence of grief in dogs, in chimps, in gorillas, in elephants, in toothed whales, probably baleen whales. We've seen it. And there's also no doubt in my mind that in some of those cases, there is an element of what we would call consciousness involved. But the thing that is so special about humans is the degree of elaboration of consciousness and the degree to which it is not confined to individual skulls. That is to say, our ability to transmit abstract ideas between skulls through language allows us to actually share a consciousness, which is something I believe that we do in the most literal sense, and I believe is actually the fundamental rudiment of consciousness, and that unfortunately we've botched the job of studying it because we take individual consciousness to be primary when in fact it is secondary.
But, well, I'm of the line of the animal investigators, let's say, that, you know, there's this injunction that's frequently delivered to people who study animals that you should be careful of anthropomorphizing them. But I don't really like that idea. I think that you should assume continuity unless there's evidence to the contrary.
I feel the exact same way. People constantly say, don't anthropomorphize this or that. It's like, no, I am not. I'm trying to put my, empathize with their position. And not just reduce it to nothing because, well, they're just a dog, just a cat. It's like, that's why I'm kind of against fixing male cats. There's for birth control point, there's no point to it. If there's a fertile male cat anywhere in the neighborhood, and there are any fertile females that are gettable, they're gotten, and it just takes one. So fixing them is kind of it's spooning back the ocean with a fork. And I can't on simple behavioral standpoint, I can't really justify cutting another dude's nuts off just so he'll be nicer and not make it stink.
People reflexively assume that consciousness is a consequence of the development of the higher order brain centers, the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, and all of that. But you can lose an awful lot of cortical territory and still maintain consciousness. So I think consciousness is, it's very difficult to pin down exactly what it is. There's a phenomenological aspect to it, which is extraordinarily mysterious. The fact that experience exists is almost indistinguishable from the idea that being itself exists. And so it's a very deep idea. But I think that consciousness is an ancient phenomena. Elaborated self-conscious that's linguistic, that's a different story. That seems to be something that's, well, comparatively new and also comparatively unique.
It's at least unique in the degree that it allows us to work in conscious space and innovate. So the delayed gratification point that you were making earlier, it is certainly true that a squirrel caching acorns is involved in something that is clearly reflective of an instinct, as you say, towards delayed gratification. We don't know how much the squirrel knows about it, but we humans can innovate. We can decide that our ultimate objective is something deep in the future, and we can link together many different costs that we might be willing to pay in the short term in order to get there, and do a very elaborate version of what a squirrel or salmon or any one of a number of creatures do in a rudimentary form. But the degree to which that is distinct is so substantial that in some sense it's its own category.
Yes, yes. Well, and we can also reflect on it as you're doing. And I think the critical, apart from the ability to reflect on it, the critical element there is that we can delay gratification in a way that no other human being in our ancestral chain has ever delayed gratification. Whereas squirrel A and squirrel offspring B pretty much do exactly the same thing. And that's part of the innovation idea. And if they do innovate, that's usually a consequence of difference in environment between squirrels rather than any innovative capacity that's inherent to the squirrel. That's even true of chimpanzees, as far as I can tell. There is some variation in tool use, but I think the simplest explanation for that is, well, there's variation in environment. So those things that offer them to the rudimentary tool themselves to the rudimentary tool using capacity of the chimp vary from environment to environment. That's the innovation.
I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I from several sources heard a story about an ape that it's probably anywhere from the 30s to the 50s. The behavioral scientists locked an ape up in a room where they arranged 4 ways to escape and watched to see which one the ape could figure out. The ape escaped the 5th way. So there is innovation.
To my way of thinking, because of compound interest, you don't need much innovative capacity for it to become explosive very, very rapidly on the evolutionary time scale. Like if a chimp could innovate 0.1% a year, it would only be, let's say, 1 million years before there was an advanced chimpanzee society. And we don't see that. So the evidence is, well, the innovation doesn't occur, or if it does, it's certainly not cumulative. It can't be transmitted. And that's also something of crucial importance.
Or it exists in a bounded context where it pays less and less.
In general semantics, what they're referring to is time binding, basically. Human beings are the only ones who know where and when we are and can communicate that information to people that aren't even born yet.
You do see roughly what you're describing in the 6 million year trajectory from our split from chimpanzee ancestors. We have seen several cumulative booms, right? It's not a perfectly consistent rate, but there has been an elaboration of capacity. And in fact, the best argument for why our lineage looks different is that we achieved something that my PhD advisor called ecological dominance, which is the state at which it is competition with other members of your species that is the strongest determinant of your evolutionary success, at which point you have an arms race. And so basically human capacity for thought was built up as one group competed against another and innovated against another, which of course would make tremendous use of language as a conduit between consciousness.
I don't know if either one will bring it up, or against themselves. Look at something like moose. They didn't get those bloody antlers competing against anything but other bloody moose. It was the bull moose themselves competing amongst themselves that can take them in those directions, correct?
Facilitate adaptation. So in the chimp case, I would argue the very limited capacity to transmit abstract ideas between chimps is running up against the degree to which one can escape the limits of the ecological context in which the chimp finds itself. So there's the capacity for cumulative culture, even in chimps, but its ability to extract more and more from the world is limited by the ecological context.
I would love to see an experiment where they find an extended, set of troops of chimps, and then start abducting young females, taking them, teaching them just enough basic sign language to decide, then putting them back, because the females are much less likely to be screwed with when they return. The male, who knows? But do that for a while until the matriarch is one of the ones that you started with, and see what they do. Don't do anything else. Just take individuals away, teach them enough to do this, and put them back. Don't interfere anymore. and just see how much
So
of the sign language is incorporated.
I know something that I'd like to talk to you about. I have some evolutionary ideas. I've been wrestling with these for a long time about the origins of, I suppose, the origins of religious ideas, the evolutionary origins of religious ideas. And so I'd like to run those by you a little bit.
Can I put you on pause? This
you certainly can.
You reminded me of what I wanted to talk to you about as a result of what you were saying in that last segment.
Okay.
And it is exactly on this topic. So we are converging here. So my point was going to be that actually belief in something like an afterlife is it's consistent, at least, with the hypothesis that evolution is extending the possible, if gratification can be delayed till after death, right? That in effect, by building an afterlife on which you reflect during your actual life, one can effectively reschedule the rewards such that it is fine by you to pay a cost that you are not repaid in life.
I agree and disagree. It's not, God is all. We are an inextricable part of that. It's not delaying gratification because there's no one to give us anything. It's a recognition that you're already there, that you are one, that there is nothing to be given.
Be repaid later, and in some sense, it is repaid, but not in the form that the mythology would tell us. It's repaid in the form of your descendants, the carriers of your genes, being well positioned in their future going forward. And so,
see, it's ideas like that motivated, at least in part, the discussions that I had with Sam Harris, because that's a really good example, assuming that it's valid, and it might be, and it might not be. Like, we can't tell. That's an idea. Let's say your proposition is that's an idea that in some sense is objectively false, but evolutionarily true.
Metaphorically true, but literally false.
Yeah. Yes, but because it furthers adaptation, and it's at some point it's difficult to. At some point, you have to make it's difficult to draw a distinction between truth as it's defined pragmatically and on the Darwinian landscape, and truth as it's defined when your concern is the nature of the objective world. And that was really at the core of the discussion that I wanted to continually have with Sam, and I think did have with some degree of success.
I agree with what you just said, and the difficult point. Sometimes I can make this point to the scientifically minded about the phenomenon of religious mythology. It becomes very difficult to make the reverse point, which I heard you just make there, which is actually, if you look at the way we do science, effectively, we start out with a large fraction of a model that we have for some phenomenon. And the large fraction is effectively metaphorically true, literally false. It's good enough in order to operate in the space, but it's not accurate if you pursue the phenomenology. And over time, what you get
is an inexplicable pause.
Is models that contain less and less of that metaphorical truth and are closer and closer to literal laboratory truth. You never get to zero, right, as far as we know. But the fact that we get better causes us not to realize that it was in some sense an analog of the instinct to religious faith that effectively provides the faith to explore.
Belief, not faith. Faith is when you impose what you want it to be, hope it is, wish it is, have been told it is, on evidence. Belief is when all experience leaves you with nowhere else to go.
It's from alchemy. No,
interesting.
Well, it's exactly that argument, is that from the Jungian perspective, the alchemists were possessed, and the fantasy was that the redemptive substance could be found in the bowels of matter, in base matter, and the perfection of matter would reveal the redemptive substance. And now, the reason that Jung insisted upon that was because he was trying to account for why people became motivated to pursue the painstaking behaviors and observations that made up empirical science, which may not be motivationally significant in and of themselves. They have to be associated with something that is of motivational significance. So it was a redemptive fantasy. And that's also partly what convinced me that the scientific enterprise is in some sense ineradicably nested inside a narrative. And the narrative is, well, if we explore the material world, the objective material world, that will be of benefit to all of us. And that's not a scientific proposition. That's an a priori statement of faith that motivates everything that constitutes the scientific enterprise.
If we go back to Genesis, Adam's only job really in the beginning was to name things. And to name it, you've got to know what is it, and understand it.
That's another example of the same thing. I've been thinking about the development of the idea of the hero, and I suppose the archetype of the hero, the hero doesn't go any farther than the messianic story. By definition, I would say. That's sort of where it tops out. And so how might have that evolved? Well, it seems to me that it's a consequence of us living in hierarchies. And we tend to think of hierarchies as hierarchies of power, especially when we're looking at the animal kingdom. Although with chimpanzees, and even other animals, it's not clear that that's the case at all. That DeWhitney has shown, the primatologist has shown quite clearly that chimpanzee troops are a lot more stable when the dominant male, because it is a patriarchy. Chimpanzees are essentially a patriarchal society. If the alpha male is cooperative and generous and kind to the females and their offspring, there's a lot less internal conflict inside the troop, and there's a higher probability that the guy in charge is going to stay in charge. And so what that strongly implies is that the hierarchy that's predicated on good faith game playing, reciprocal game playing, and reciprocity is more stable, even biologically speaking, than one that's based on nature red in tooth and claw. And then you can imagine, so then take it another step. So imagine you have a hierarchy, and the most effective way of moving up that hierarchy across time, so that would be something that's stable across multiple landscapes of selection, is whatever moves you up the hierarchy. And the reason that benefits fitness is because the females are more likely to mate with the males that array themselves near the top of the hierarchy. And so then imagine that we've been in these hierarchies forever, and we've observed successful behavior and have an instinct to admire it, because that instinct to admire it facilitates mimicry. And then imagine that we've learned to mimic multiple aspects of behavior that are associated with reciprocity and fair play that move people up competence hierarchies. And so we've evolved, morality has actually evolved to match biologically what's being demanded by the social hierarchy. And then we abstract out of that the ideal, which is that pattern of behavior that moves you across the largest number of dominance hierarchies. And that actually exists in our imagination as a latent religious symbol. And then that's filled up by narrative, constantly refilled and filled.
So basically what he is saying, that depending on the period of time you were visiting there, the Greeks were either really, really nice people or complete pricks. I mean, the ancient Greek gods were just like obnoxious. But then you got the later Christian Greek influence. Interesting contrast with the same peoples.
And the awe that inspires is, if you're thinking about it biologically, is the manifestation of the instinct to imitate. And then you think, okay, then you can take that one step farther if that's true. And believe me, I'd welcome a critique, because if there's something wrong with that idea, I'd really like to know it. That ideal does, in fact, end up being the most effective way to live in the broadest possible sense. And so it's valid. And then you might ask, well, is it objectively valid? And that's a very difficult thing to say, because generally we're not very good at looking at complex patterns as objective reality. We tend to have to reduce things to their material substrate, and we can get a grip on what's materially true as we become more and more reductionistic. But at those higher levels of abstraction, like hierarchies have been around for a very, very long time. It's not unreasonable to assume that there's a characteristic pattern of behavior that moves you up or down a hierarchy. It's not unrealistic to assume that we would be able to note when we're partaking of that or observing it or violating it. That's conscience, as far as I can tell. And it isn't unreasonable to note that our perceptions of that might be accurate. Now, what that means metaphysically, see, I don't understand that either, because human beings are unbelievably complicated. We have the most complicated nervous systems that there are. Our brains are the most complex structures that we know of, except for other brains. So we are the most complex thing that we know of. And so we're a pinnacle of sorts. And I'm not saying that evolution is driving towards that pinnacle, but in terms of cognitive elaboration, it has. So is the ideal form of that is it unreasonable to propose that the ideal form of that complexity is divine? The universe has been aiming at it since day one in some sense.
I totally agree with the way you just summed that up. Intelligent life is God's, we're the hands and eyes of God. We are the way God dealt with not being in time, not being able to affect anything, to change anything. So we're the part of God's ego that gets stuffed into time. And looking out from our eyes, we cope with that reality, die. The essence, the ego, is still there. It's only the personality that kind of goes back into the recycler. The essence of who we are the universe. We are all one.
Well, so the universe has not been aiming at it, as far as I can tell. What it does is tend towards something. It tends toward a kind of stability. And what you're arguing, I hear some things in it.
Well, I didn't want to smuggle in a too overt teleology, but, here we are and everything. We actually did emerge. So, and it's not obvious what to make of that. It could have been otherwise. You can say that, but it wasn't. So.
Right. So here we are. And I think, what I get from what you're saying, and the part I agree with, is that I think people like both you and me are too used to having to argue that these patterns are adaptive and therefore entitled to a whole host of defenses that they are not generally given, or at least they are entitled to leeway to be evaluated on honorable grounds rather than castigated for the fact that they don't match up with experiment or something along those lines. I do think,
or desire.
Well, that's where I'm going next. Is the thing that I don't hear in what you're saying, the bitter pill here, is that ultimately, or maybe not, I won't say ultimately, but historically, the genes have been in charge every step of the way. That is to say, all of the stuff that we do above the gene level, all of the cultural stuff, all of the conscious stuff, has been in service of the genes. And that's unfortunate, but
no, there is a flaw in that. I thought about that. Well, look, in human beings, increasingly, consciousness structures the mechanism that selects the genes. Mm-hmm. So here's an example. Let's say, I'll see if I can get this right. So imagine, for example, that you live in a hunter-gatherer troop, and you have a great hunter in your midst. And he's great for two reasons. One is that he can hunt, but the other reason is that he shares. And so that makes him a really great hunter. And so you elevate his status. Now you elevate his status. It's like you all vote, all the men vote. Here's the good guy. He's on top. Now the price you pay for that is a reduction, at least on one level, of your own biological fitness, because by elevating him up the hierarchy, you increase the probability that he's going to be chosen as a mate. Now, the benefit of that, however, is that, you get to eat and you don't die.
You didn't take that far enough. It's not just you get to eat and you don't die, is you get more time to procreate yourself, and you get a better environment to encourage that procreation. So it's a win-win.
By that continual voting on what constitutes competence and the arrangement of those hierarchies, our conscious minds have structured the landscape that actually selects. So men vote on which men are likely to mate. And then the women compete for access to that victor.
He is right as far as it goes, but he's leaving out the whole layer of the genes that the women choose to use that aren't part of the official hierarchy. If you know what I mean. I mean, they did studies on the DNA of swans, which are notoriously monogamous-ish, kind of. Well, it seems they live together for life. They bond for life. As far as offspring, that's a little more of an open book.
The consciousness is shaping the genes as much as the genes are shaping the consciousness.
The consciousness is in control of the behavior, but it is subservient to the objective of the genes. And unfortunately, I think the situation is that you've been handed a feeble toolkit by evolutionary biologists and are trying to make sense of the world as if it was higher quality than it is. So I don't want to drag you or our viewers too deeply into the weeds here. But my claim is that my field is divided between two camps that are incorrect. One camp are the kin selectionists, right? People who view this as narrowly genetic. These are my intellectual ancestors. And the other group are the group selectionists who have understood something else, which is that essentially altruism pays. And there are certain places you can...
This is something I say forever and ever and ever. If you are in a school of thought with defensible boundaries, if you have to follow this, blah, 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 you're wrong. It's just a maxim. You're wrong. Because you've closed yourself off to what's actually happening. As soon as you close the circle on that, school of thought and made it into an us and everyone else, all of them always are wrong for that very reason. They don't pay enough attention to the fact that it's always going to be some kind of a mix. It's never just one anything that does one anything.
Mathematically, it is very difficult to make a robust model of this sort, at least not a realistic one. My point would be the kin selectionists have understood one part of the logic correctly, but they've instantiated it too narrowly. The group selectionists have found a fiction, but just as we were describing 15 minutes ago, that fiction has actually given them license to explore a very fertile piece of evolutionary territory, which is the landscape of cultural evolution, right? Cultural evolution does not make a tremendous amount of sense through the narrowest kin-selected lens. It makes a great deal of sense through the group-selected lens, but the gateway is fictional. And so
I think you have to bring that down to earth more before I can completely follow what you're...
Yeah.
I'm going to harass you about critiquing my specific point after that anyway.
Okay, good.
But
so
I'm trying to follow, but I put some examples would probably help me make sure I'm following you.
Let's take your example and let's put it into what I think the right way of resolving this conflict in evolutionary biology is. So I would argue that the right way of viewing this is something called lineage selection. Now, a lineage is an individual and all of that individual's descendants. Okay? And my point is that is actually a valid target of evolution. Lineages can evolve just the same way individuals can evolve. So we can see adaptation at the lineage level, which will look like, if you don't pay close enough attention to what you're looking at, it may look like group evolution, which is in part why the group selectionists have gotten themselves confused. But here's the point. Let's take your hunter-gatherer band and the case of the individual male who is an excellent hunter and is also valued by his male companions because he shares, and therefore his status in the group provides some increased likelihood of mating, which could be taken as an evolutionary loss from the point of view of his male competitors inside of his band, but I would argue isn't one. And the reason is this. Let's think about this band if everybody took a narrow view of their own contribution to the next generation, right? If all the males did was try to leave as many genes in the next generation as possible by whatever means necessary, right? That's a band full of conflict, right? Now, if we look across the larger landscape, all of the bands of hunter-gatherers, how much does the competition between two individuals within one band over mates affect how many copies of their genes are on that larger landscape? And the answer is almost not at all, right? That is to say, you can have 10 offspring to some other individual's 2, right? And you might think that you've beaten them by a factor of 5. But there are 2 problems with this. One, if you are closely related to him, then a lot of what we narrowly in the traditional kin-selected view would regard as a loss to you is actually insignificant compared to the larger landscape. But the other thing is, if your band blinks out of existence 5 generations down the road, taking all of your great, 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 great grand offspring, right? If it takes all those people with him, then you have not succeeded. The advantage you got within one generation is completely erased by the loss of the population within which you were embedded. So the point is, if we really understood the mindset of the individual in rational evolutionary terms, we would understand that they, in some sense, will be built. They will be wired and programmed to behave in such a way, both to advance their own genetic interests and to protect the long-term population well-being that allows those genes to circulate, right? They will effectively be protecting a gene pool. Now, the group selectionists will jump and they will say, aha.
That's pretty much just a slight extension of what I just said a little earlier about that, on that subject. And he's looking at it a slightly broader than I took it, but it's talking about the exact same thing.
It is not the group. It is a lineage.
You see that in human history. Families have always been what individuals are dying for on that level. If it might be just a, wife and kids level, but it's the family. It's not just one kid. It's not just this one, offspring. It's the family. It is the future.
That is responsible for the adaptation here. You can dismiss it as a group, but that's like saying that I threw a frisbee.
What practical difference do you think that makes in relationship to what are the implications of that view compared to the implications of a group selection viewpoint?
Well, they're subtly distinct, but I would argue in the end decisive. So, for example, if you take the group selection view and you do not recognize the game theoretic instability at its core, then you may struggle to find a formulation of Marxism, for example, that realizes the full benefits of human cooperation, not realizing that the structure you build will be inherently unstable and that you have to actually correct for that instability, which will either happen through brutality, which you don't want, right? Or you will have to architect something much closer to what Elinor Ostrom discovered in her Nobel Prize winning work about the way indigenous peoples do this very job. So I guess the point is the group selection, I would argue, is a temporary misunderstanding of lineage selection, but it does a good enough job to allow those who are involved in thinking in a group selected way to see human cultural evolution for what it is. And that's where the payoff comes. And so my point is we can now go back, having found human cultural evolution, which is where the heavy lifting is done, we can now go back and correct the group selected viewpoint, and we can make it rigorous by looking at it as a lineage phenomenon, not a group phenomenon. And we have then a continuous understanding, which then we've gotten super complicated here, and I wish we hadn't. But I will point out, though, that the upshot of this, from my perspective, is the genes have been in charge all along. They have acted through consciousness. They have acted through culture. But those things have been subordinate to genetic objectives. But now that we have consciousness, we can look at what it is that genes would have us do, and we can actually take them out of that control position. And we must, because they contain things like programs for genocide and warfare that we must sideline if we're going to survive.
But again, that's what terrifies me, because control always comes before understanding. We can influence before we have wisdom. And this is an area that, buckle your seatbelts, folks.
We now have to turn the tables on the genes, which is not easy, but I also don't think it's impossible.
Okay, so I'm going to branch out two ways there. There's no objections to the argument that you laid out come into my mind, and it's obviously something you've thought about a lot, and I can't spin up a hypothesis about lineage selection versus group selection sort of on the cuff. I would say, however, that it isn't clear to me how that argument, independent of its validity, is related to my original proposition that it's misleading in some sense to think of the genes more in charge than the consciousness. They're looping with one another because consciousness is in fact making choices about what constitutes those that will be elected to the status of more likely maters. And so that doesn't have any detrimental effect, as far as I'm concerned, on the idea of genetic. I'm not trying to devalue the power of genes across time at all, but if consciousness is selecting the mechanism that selects, then it's definitely altering the probability that genes are going to propagate across time. I would say your lineage argument, in some sense, actually likely makes that case more strongly, because, look, one of the things I outlined in Beyond Order, I touched on it a little bit in the previous book, was the idea that, an action, you undertake an action to gain a particular goal in a particular framework of time. So all of your actions are bounded in space and time. You don't want it to take forever, and you don't want it to occupy everywhere, right? So you're operating locally, but you have to operate locally in a way, this is like the lineage idea, in a way that doesn't disturb your next local action or the one after that. You have to think about your action now, its consequences immediately, its consequences in a day, a week, a month, a year, and that shades off forever. And so an optimal action is one that takes you where you want to go now, but doesn't interfere with your ability to get to where you want to go in the future, or maybe even makes that easier. And so you could say we're sophisticated enough so that we not only look for patterns of behavior to admire that work now, but we look for patterns of behavior that work now in a way that isn't compromising the future. And that's why, for example, I think that we admire and track reciprocity. And that's obviously something you're interested in as someone who worked with Trivers. We track reciprocity unbelievably well. And I would say that's at least in part because reciprocity is a game that sustains itself across time. And that's actually a place where you can see our eye to the future operating. If I do you a favor and you don't return it, you're not trustworthy over the long run. I can't rely on you.
Gets back to to me, the only commandment is the golden rule, positive and negative. Do unto, don't do unto. And that's it. It's ultimately driven by self-interest, supposedly, which is biologically compatible with everything we know, but it produces the closest thing human beings get to ethical behavior is when they operate from that position.
Afford you any benefits, evolutionarily or otherwise.
So
any flaws in that you see?
no, I would say that there's another rung to that ladder. So as an undergraduate, I worked with Trivers, and reciprocity was obviously a key feature of his contribution to the field. My graduate advisor, Dick Alexander, contributed the idea of indirect reciprocity, in which typically mediated through things like reputation. It does not have to be repaid by the individual for whom you've done the service. And of course, this actually underlies the evolution of economic systems and the like. But I want to go back to the question you asked me about whether or not the genes are not, in fact, in some ways subject to the consciousness. There's a limited way in which that is true. Clearly, the genes exist in an environment in which the consciousness has a great deal of say over what the genes get to do. But here's the problem. Let's take it away from people for a second so that we can see this clearly. The genes of a spider exist in all of the spider's cells, incapable of doing anything, exerting any force on the world whatsoever, except through the spider. So you might say that actually the body of the spider is in some ways in charge of the gene's well-being, and that's true. But if you had a group of spiders that woke up to the fact that their bodies were in fact in charge and that their genes couldn't force them to do anything, and those spiders decided instead of investing in spider ecology stuff, they were going to invest in spider hedonism, right? Something like that, so that the spiders were just doing what their bodies felt like doing and not what their genes wanted them doing, which is to spread those genes. Then those individual spiders would indeed be in control. They could do exactly what they wanted. But what would happen is those spiders that made that decision would fail to pass on their genes. And 2 spider generations later, they would be gone. And the spiders that we...
Well, I would certainly... I'm thinking of a bidirectional effect, obviously. I mean, it's clear, I think you're absolutely right, that consciousness can make decisions that are going to put genetic evolution to a halt.
What I'm saying actually is that we must do that if we are to survive, but I believe it is the most difficult puzzle human beings have ever faced.
If we have a Newton of what he's talking about, worrying about blowing up your next door neighbor with your experiment is one thing. Worrying about turning the entire biological reality of human beings into hell, or ending it with an oops. Even with the experience he's had, he still is a goldfish from a certain type of bowl. He's still swimming around in those circles to a large extent, especially earlier on. The way he was talking was, as you could see, he keeps wanting to pull it back into that shape that's compatible, and it just doesn't quite get there. He's honest enough with himself that he lets it take it where he's going to go. I mean, the two of them together, I mean, Peterson, it's mainly just, if he was a polymath, he would be incredible. He would be, I don't know what it would be. I mean, if he took 2 years off just to study physics, just take a stop, think about this, forget about psychology for it, just learn this crap from the ground up until you meet yourself. My God, the things he'd be coming up with. You cannot even begin to discuss serious theology unless you have the ability to be a philosopher and have a solid enough grounding in science to have at least a toehold on reality, because that's where God lives, after all.
We have to confront the genes. The genes awarded us the most amazing computational machinery in the known universe. They also awarded us the ability to pursue and appreciate beauty, to be compassionate. They awarded us all of those things as a means to a narrow genetic end, a very uninteresting one. And the point is,
I'm not sure if that was a sad comment on his sex life or not, but well, we'll let it go.
Do appreciate beauty, and we can be compassionate, and we appreciate people who have good characteristics. We have to look at what we're programmed for and say, actually, no, the machine is capable of something honorable, whereas the genetic objective is actually 100% identical to the genetic objective of every other creature with genes. That is to say, the capacity of a human being is spectacular. It is unrivaled. But the purpose of a human being is no different than the purpose of a liver fluke or an oak tree.
Bingo. I mean, I like to say to people, especially males, most males in mammals at least, and certainly humans, I mean, we're a mutation. We're the female that's the center of human. That's human. And then they're taking advantage of the fact that they can put the genes over with this dude until their granddaughter needs to shuffle them, and does wonders for sexual selection. But that's the purpose of a human male, is somebody to die for the home front and somebody to carry the genes until you need them. But human society is centered on females.
Pass on its genes. And given that we can now see that we don't want to be advancing our genetic interests, because frankly, that's not a defensible goal, but we do honor the things that our machine is capable of, we have to place those things at a higher position in the hierarchy. And the critical part, the difficult part, is we have to do that without giving an advantage to people who refused to give up the genetic program as their primary objective.
God, I feel like I'm caught in a modern incarnation of the arguments between Freud and Jung.
Is that right?
Yes, because
but I'm not playing Freud's role.
Yes,
am I?
I think you are.
Oh,
it's
terrible.
not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. But
I would agree.
What I hear is genes as id.
I would agree with that.
Let me just walk through the analogy and tell me what you think. Genes as id and superego as control mechanism. So what you see in Freud continually is the idea that base impulses have to be inhibited, and that's actually the primary function of civilization. And the brain is an inhibitory mechanism in large part, and so there's a neurological rationale for that. We shut off many things all the time. They're lurking and ready to leap forth, but they're inhibited. But there's two ways of thinking about such things as the regulation of aggression. We can work with aggression and sexuality. Those they come together. We started with rape. They come together very well there. So, do you inhibit aggression? Do you inhibit sexuality? Or do you spin them together with a variety of other impulses and make them into like a dynamic and harmonic game where they have their say, where you have access to their force?
Oh my God, he's talking disco.
They're not manifest in a way that is incompatible with long-term reciprocity. And then I would say, I wouldn't underestimate the genes, because I think that not only do they code for the aggressive impulses, which they clearly do, and the sexual impulses, which they clearly do, but I think they also code for behavioral patterns that represent the integration of those into a reciprocal game. I think we're sophisticated enough biologically for that. And that's why I think that that's why we have the capacity to admire high order ethical behavior. Now, there might be a bit of a competition, so that the genes that control or bring about aggression have been around for so long and are so primordial and powerful that the biology that allows us to integrate and to recognize integration is of insufficient power to regulate them. That's a possibility, but I think that our biology, I think the biology of ethics is more sophisticated than mere inhibition.
Well, so, boy, there's a lot to say here. One, I think you're hearing echoes of the debate between Freud and Jung. I don't think the positions map. And what I would argue is that Freud clearly has something right with respect to inhibition. In some sense, human beings have a range of behaviors that they are endowed with genetically, and then the program that they acquire through nurture limits where those programs are deployed. It may turn certain programs permanently latent. And my point is that's a natural process. Jung is focused somewhere different, right? Freud is focused on the inhibition itself. And I must say, I'm not well versed in Freud, but with things like the Oedipal complex, the electric complex, I believe he's got it dead wrong. He basically botched the job because he saw a pattern that he recognized, and in fact, it was a slightly different pattern. But we can return there later. My point would be, we have a natural process of those inhibitions being wielded in an ever more sophisticated way that does ever better sideline things like violence. Society is getting less violent. If you look over a long time scale, it's getting less violent in terms of your risk walking down the street, more tolerant, etc. But the problem is that has functioned as a means to an end, and the end is a genetic one, even though we're not aware of it. If you look at society, any society, it may look increasingly peaceful, but in part, it's being increasingly peaceful on the inside is strengthening it for battle with other societies on the outside. And ultimately, we can't play that game forever, right? There are no new continents. Our weapons are too powerful. We are too interconnected.
I think I agree with where he's going with that. Humans are built to need adversary. Maybe that's why we invented Lucifer. Those old Jews had a lot on the ball. If you get into the scripture that Christianity was actually based in, there's a lot of good stuff in there. We need an adversary. We need someone to, some reason to circle the wagons because of our capacity for the other way. But you need to be able to circle the wagons. You have to have that capacity for the violence and all that. So, yeah, I mean, it all works out.
We continue to allow a dynamic that brought us here to rule, to govern our behavior, we will extinguish ourselves in short order. So my point is the genes and competition between lineages was good enough to generate.
Back into it, he said, just destroy ourselves. That's why I'm a nationalist. I believe in nationalism. I think we like a statism for the country. We need to keep things as local as they can be, whatever it is that's under discussion. Whatever's being done, what's the most local level it can be managed from. That's where it needs to be held from. The planet, we need to have a whole bunch of neighborhoods that do things their way. And if we have enough of them, blowing up the whole thing kind of becomes...
It also generated all the horrifying stuff. It is now time for us to choose between them, because in some sense, we've run to the end of the tape. We have now gotten to a place where the game that brought us here will be fatal.
The stuff from the 20th century he's referring to happened because trying to take control of too large a swath of human society on the planet. And that's where it led. Every respect for, people being able to fertilize their own damn lawn the way they want to. That's probably the hinge pin of, survival of humanity.
That with essentially certainty, at this point, because of the power of our tools, right? 500 years ago, a human population that was foolish could extinguish itself, but it couldn't extinguish humanity. And now we're at the point where a foolish population can take humanity out, and it's only a matter of time.
Maybe a foolish individual.
Yeah, even a foolish individual.
Well, increasingly we're moving to. Well, I certainly don't disagree with that. That danger. I guess I've always been attracted to the Jungian idea of integration of the shadow, and that is not an inhibition argument. It's an integration argument, and so I would say, rather than, and I think this is an important difference, is that there's lots of ways that you can be a warrior that are in keeping with reciprocity, but allow that fundamental motivational force to still have its say. Now, one of the things that I think capitalism is underappreciated for its vices. So it's better that warlike men establish mercantile empires than empires of war. And I think rather than the whole scale remodeling of our group, of our proclivity for group aggression, we need to figure out how to refine and orient it. So capitalism is a landscape of competition. It's not only that, because it's also a landscape of cooperation. And virtually everything we do is a landscape of competition and cooperation. But I see, for example, misguided efforts to insist that all games among children be cooperative as a way of dampening down the competitive impulse. And to me, that's going to make things worse rather than better. Now,
I agree with him. I mean, competition, it's again, we need the adversary. We need that. That's what motivates us. The tendency to cooperate is what lets us do something with that motivation. But with one without the other is poison. I mean, you can take all that masculine, motivation, and if it's not coupled with something, then it goes crazy. If you don't have a motivation, the wisest plans in the world just sit there and molder.
Look, we share a common view of this problem. The problem is that we've become so technologically powerful that our moral failings are increasingly fatal. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, my answer to that, to the degree that I have one, is that, well, we learn to play the best of all possible games. And we bring all of that evolutionary heritage on board to play that game.
I think he's underestimating the ameliorating effects. Think about it. With the technological age, I mean, just with the industrial age, the ability for a single human to just kind of go, yeah, fuck it, and take out one to however many people in an instant of just random motivation, it never happened. There was no massive spike of homicides that coincided with the beginning of the industrial age and now the technological age. Just imagine how much somebody, I mean, how easy is it to hack into a local traffic light system and kill a whole bunch of people one day? It doesn't happen. There's something that is keeping this collective unconscious, it's keeping us from taking that step where, 500 years ago, the average man put in that kind of a situation with that power, you did have people kind of like losing it and causing enough havoc, that you can imagine then. It stopped. It actually slowed down. Gunpowder and then industrialization, and that all slowed down in kind of a reverse curve. The more power the individual had to totally just wipe everything, in their immediate vicinity, or target utter devastation, it never manifested. It actually went back. It pulled back without any overriding societal pressure that I can see. That's why they killed Epstein. The only way to solve the problem. It's like that's the only way. There's no way in the normal world to shut him up. He had too much power of that kind you're speaking of right now. It was just like that. There was no other solution on their horizon. We just had our nose rubbed in just how blatantly they can do that. It's the success of Western civilization is we don't have to, we don't have to view the ruling, clique as adversaries unless they make us. In the East, it's automatic. You are a function of them. They are not a function of you. So it only goes one way. So the violence is automatic. Violence is automatically in the system, in the Asian an Eastern mindset.
I would say, I think we're in near perfect agreement here. We have to learn each other's language about it.
Yes.
But what I would say is, an explosion is a very dangerous thing, but it's a marvelous thing in a cylinder where it can be used to do physical work. And so the point is, let's not pretend that we are something other than we are, but let's take those impulses and channel them to something productive.
The difference between the two of them, Weinstein's much more the academic. He throws ideas around without really thinking about, how would you actually do this at all? It's just, it's all theoretical. It's very ivory tower, frankly. He needs to climb down and understand that people are affected by this. Peterson is much more aware because of his start, studying the horrific things of the 20th century. There's no illusions there. He knows what can happen. And he's a bit more cautious in throwing around these like blanket, things. But he too talks too much, I think, about wanting to control this or change that, when understanding enough to touch the controls without going over a cliff is more where I think we should be.
That is really what I'm trying to do in these 3 books, is to say, well, look, don't underestimate your downside, your capacity for mayhem, but don't assume that makes you unredeemable. Don't be so afraid of it that you can't admit to it. That'll make it even worse. And find something better to do.
Totally agree.
We're jealous and resentful and vengeful and bitter and all of those things. And I also, especially in chapter 11 of the new book, try to explain why we have those motivations and why they're so powerful. Again, to give the devil his due, but to say nonetheless, well, we have to get beyond that, despite the reasons for our motives, for our dark motives.
Well, the thing is, we know that we are capable of marvelous things. And frankly, I don't think this puzzle is as hard as it seems if we set ourselves to it. If we're continually battling over whether or not it's real, then I don't think we're going to make it. But
okay, so let me offer you a practical problem. I've been talking to Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley on my podcasts, and they're future optimists. Within a materialistic framework, fundamentally, both of them insist that things are not as dire as they're painted. But regardless of that, what they do point to, like Steven Pinker, I would say, is that we've made tremendous progress on all sorts of dimensions in the last 300 or 400 years. And there's every reason to assume that we could continue doing that over the next 100 years if we got our priorities straight. It's within our capability. And so you can look at such things. And I think these are hard bits of data, although time frame is always a problem. There are far fewer people in abject poverty by proportion now than there were 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, there were much fewer than there was 100 years ago. And that trajectory appears to be continuing. We can continue to make incremental improvements in the material well-being of everyone. And there's limits, obviously, and the economists and the biologists argue about what those limits might be.
I think he's missing a whole point there is, how far should we take it? I think we're at the edge if we haven't already just barely gone past it. I think that if you look at maybe add a few more conveniences to a 1930s American middle class, existence, and, like I say, add a few things like vaccines and such to get rid of, minor annoyances like polio. That's the level, I think, of comfort we need to strive. And if we're not made to strive, we get weaker. So we need to let our society have a built-in, do it yourself or it doesn't get done to it, and not go so techno that we turn into a bunch of blobs plugged into the computers and then die out in a generation.
It's not saleable. it doesn't have, for some reason, it doesn't have the kind of motive power that enables people to get on board and get enthusiastic about it.
Well, I also don't think, I don't think it's, I must say, I have mixed reactions. I'm a fan of Ridley's, not so much Lomborg's. And I have mixed feelings about Pinker's view. There's obviously some truth in it, but I believe it goes out of its way to miss the counter argument. And
well, it might. It might go out of its way to miss the, even from a rhetorical perspective. And, I would look at that symbolically. I would say, look, there's a tyrant and there's a wise king, and they're both there. And if you only look at the tyrant, that's the corruption of society, then you're missing half the story. And I would imagine that Pinker would say, well, people are looking at the tyrant so hard that we need to look at the wise king a little bit more.
Well, I would take a different approach to this. So I would argue that things have gotten better. The Pinker pattern is recognizable, but that it cannot be indefinitely extended. And that the limit is that we've come to a place where lineage versus lineage competition on a planet of this size with a population as large as we have and the technologies that we've got is a fatal proposition, almost no matter how it plays out. So in order to take the pattern that has continued to this point and extend it indefinitely into the future, you have to do two things. One of them we've already described, which is you have to take the genes out of the driver's seat, which is frankly in the long-term interests of the genes, but genes are too dim to see it, right? So we have to take effectively something like a Buddhist approach to long-term well-being. We have to become very dedicated to the idea of sustainability. And I realize how hard it is to operationalize an idea like that. But somehow we cannot keep degrading the planet and imagining that we're going to technologically rescue it.
Well, I hope your conscience does that. Technically speaking, I mean, I'm dead serious about this because you just said something of crucial importance, and I think it's at the core. There's an argument that's always going on now between biologists and economists. I would say that they're the two camps, and the economists say human ingenuity can continually rescue us from whatever problems are likely to emerge, and the biologists say, well, never forget Malthus. And it's a matter of time frame, which is the argument you made. It's like, well, that's working now. There's that famous bet between Paul Ehrlich and Simon. And Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb.
Yep.
A very pessimistic book. And he believed at that point, 68, I think, that there would be mass starvation and a terrible shortage of material resources by the year 2000. And he had a famous bet with Simon, who was a genius in his own right, certainly the intellectual match for Ehrlich. And Simon said, no, I'll bet you that everything will be cheaper and people will be less hungry. And Simon won the bet.
And that's the answer to the Club of Rome.
Yeah, well, I got it wrong by 50 years, or I got it wrong by 100. Time frames deadly.
Yep.
So, but okay, we can take time frames seriously. I've been taking this idea of an intrinsic, evolutionarily determined, biologically based ethic seriously. And I think that the voice of conscience is the voice of sustainability and iterability speaking within. And it's not overwhelming.
The whole idea that we can innovate our way out of it is like, no, I have enough respect for our power as human beings to recognize that that's an absolutely stupid assumption. We have already innovated things that, with the proper sequence of events, would erase human life, all life, take your pick. I respect our power quite a lot, enough to be afraid of it.
You have to sacrifice the future for the present fairly often. It turns out that way, right? Because you have to make snap emergency decisions that might not be in your best long-term interest, but the long-term interest speaks inside you.
Agreed.
Agreed.
And so, but less and less well as we have abandoned the mythology that used to undergird it. So as we
Well,
have become
okay,
more
so why would
secular.
you say that? Why would you say that's a very interesting thing to say? Why do you believe that?
Well, first of all, the problem with cultural evolution is that if we talk about genetic adaptations, you can look at virtually any creature, virtually any appendage, virtually any behavior in a non-human creature in its natural environment and be pretty sure it makes a good deal of sense, right? The stuff that didn't make sense got pruned away. It's not there to see. How it makes sense, that's a tough question, but whether it makes sense, not tough almost ever. In human cultural evolution space, that is not the case, right? We have a huge amount of noise, stuff that will not stand the test of time, that nonetheless dominates our current cultural landscape. And so we can't go into it and assume these things make sense. So what I'm telling you is that, in my view, the religious mythology was doing jobs that we don't know. Some of them we can piece together. Some of them we'll never understand what the role of a particular mythological belief was. But what we have now is kind of an intermediate level of sophistication where we've gotten past some of the religious mythology, but without the wisdom necessary to replace it with anything that does the jobs that it was doing. And so we're now screwing up left and right.
I agree with the way he's viewing it. I mean, we stopped, we just stopped incorporating that aspect of things instead of finding different ways to look at it or deal with it. And at this point in history, it's a pretty big gaping hole in society that's pretty much a weakness.
Because most of this, to me, what's happened is that functional mythology has been replaced by inadequate ideology. And the ideology, and I wrote about this in Beyond Order, there's a chapter called Abandon Ideology. I think of ideologies as parasites on a religious platform. They have their power. The power they have is because they derive their power from an underlying mythological narrative structure. But they only tell half the story. If that's akin to that's an idea that's akin to the one that you just laid out.
Yeah, I think so. Although I think you're being generous to call it all ideology. I'd say some of it's just idiocy, right? We've replaced a structure that worked that is now not viable because it's not in the environment for which it adapted, but we've replaced it with something that doesn't stand any chance of working. And we keep, one self-inflicted wound after the next. And either we're going to figure out that pattern and recognize.
Yeah, he's 100% right. That's what's happening with the first climate change, the racial crap, COVID-19. It's just like wave after wave of idiocy, trying to get a hold of the reins, trying to grab the reins and get a hold of the wagon. And we're going to go over a cliff if we're not careful.
That the function that we're using to generate the next level of behavior and culture is a lethal hazard, or it's going to take us out. So I would say the key, if I can go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, the key to continuing the trajectory of improvement that has been recognized by Pinker and Ridley, at least, is to understand that it needs to be based on something else going forward, that the limits of the system that they are recognizing, we have to go through a revolution in the way we sustain ourselves. We cannot fuel it on lineage versus lineage competition. However, what we mustn't do is either create a stagnation that causes the human beings to react in the way that they do when they run against the limits of a landscape, a physical landscape, or run up against the limits of economic growth, both of which would be a disaster. So we have to create a steady state in which we don't degrade the planet, but we do give the human beings the sensation of living in a time of growth. That's going to be the key, right? Human beings, when they are
I want to decorate that slightly. I mean, part of the problem here too is that when you're absolutely deprived, having that deprivation remediated is powerfully motivating. But as the deprivation decreases, the motivating power of the remediation decreases. And so I would also say that arguing for the motivational viability of a more generous material landscape is also a game that is decreasing in its attractiveness. Because, one of the things I realized a few years ago was that if you're stuck in traffic, it makes very little difference how expensive your car is. That we've hit the point where many people have enough, so that having more isn't going to be of that much utility. And I'm not talking about people who are still absolutely deprived. And I understand full well that a large percentage of the population, decreasing though it may be, are still in a state of absolute deprivation. They're going to be motivated by the desire for material improvement, for sure. But those of us who are past that, and I would say that's virtually everyone in North America that isn't suffering for reasons that material cannot remediate. We're wealthy. We have heat. We have refrigeration. We have an infinite expanse of informational technology. That can all be improved, but the improvements aren't going to make that much difference. What's next? Like, what do you do when you have enough?
All right. So,
and you try to make everyone else have enough. That's something, right? That's something. And it's worth it. But even that that's happening.
Right. So I realized something over the last several weeks, which is that there's something that has bothered me about the way those of us who fear Marxism argue against it. It seems to me that we very frequently say things about how Marxism goes wrong. And these things, I would say them very somewhat differently than most people. But by and large, there's some direct connection between the attempt to create a Marxist utopia and starvation, authoritarianism. And I think I know what this is. And actually, it goes back to the question of group selection, which is because these systems are game theoretically unstable, because they punish those who do more and reward those who do less, in order to get people who are harmed by that, that is to say, those who tend to contribute more and are therefore punished by such a system, to adhere to it, you have to threaten them.
Right. They're unplayable games.
Right.
And you have to enforce them by force because people discover they're unplayable.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that unplayable game, I just want to elaborate that because you said game theoretic and you're going to lose, you'll lose a bunch of your audience because of that. But these are, stop me if I mangle this, but game theorists are interested in the repeatability of interactions. And some forms of interactions degenerate with time. Those aren't sustainable. They're not good games.
That's been a principle of mine since I was a kid. I mean, I've noticed it first with traffic rules. I mean, just unconscious ability to understand that if everybody can't do it, you shouldn't be doing it. You know, you're a jerk to be doing it because if everybody did it, it would just turn into a cluster F. Then don't do it, because just because you can get away with it because there's only you, that's not a valid path. That's not an ethical path.
Or hurt by them. You don't want to keep playing. Some games maintain themselves. And I would say we have an ethic that teaches us when we're playing a sustainable game. I think that's the voice of conscience. That's related to the points I made earlier. Your Marxism, as it's instantiated, is actually an unplayable game. And you gave a reason, is that you can't set up a system that punishes people that are productive and rewards people who aren't. Even if some of the people are only miming productivity and they're actually power-hungry tyrants. You can't clump them in with the competent people and punish all of them.
Yep.
Now,
and if you try, in order to stabilize it, in order to get those who are being punished for contributing not to defect, you have to threaten them so that authoritarianism follows quickly on the heels, as does in many cases the failure of the system to deliver even basic well-being, hence starvation.
Well, and Piaget pointed out quite explicitly, because he was very interested in games as the basis of morality, that a game that you have to punish people to adhere to is going to be outcompeted by a game that people will play by themselves.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So
a natural ethic.
So we make this argument, many of us who have this particular concern, we make this argument or some version of it. Here's the argument that I don't hear. The argument that I don't hear, but I'm certain that I believe and have believed all along, is that equality of outcome, even if you could achieve it, is in and of itself not desirable and certainly unjust.
I would love to talk about that.
I thought you might. So my argument is very simple, right? What you want is a system that leverages well-being in order to generate improvements. So in other words, you want the reward that comes from successfully competing to get individuals to contribute to collective well-being. The mythology of our economic system is that you're being rewarded for delivering stuff that's good, and that's why you're wealthy, right? Now, it happens that our economic system does a terrible job of this. It enriches lots of people who are actually harming other people. But in principle, if you were economically rewarded for generating well-being, that would be a good thing. And it is desirable, therefore, that we have a system in which people who have contributed more have earned the right to live better, and people who have contributed less do not live as well, but live at a respectable standard. And
the Bitcoin people would really like to talk to you about this, I'm sure.
They have made themselves hard to talk to, I will tell you. But
yes, well, they're hoping it's incorruptible. You know, it can't be gamed as easily. And it's an interesting argument. There's aspects of the argument that are very interesting.
Yes, they're certainly onto something. They seem to think they've found the ultimate solution to all sorts of problems, whereas I think they found a very promising avenue, but not a solution. I remain to be convinced of that. But in any case, the point is, on the left, you will very frequently hear that inequality is evidence of injustice.
Yes, I definitely wanted to return to that. So continue.
And this is not the case. A system in which people were armed with high quality tools with which to compete, in which competition rewarded behavior that contributed to our collective well-being and did not reward behavior where we harm each other, that would be a good system in which people would end up living unequally. Now, it might not be a massive level of inequality. It might be more limited, but nonetheless, the point is, those who would shoot for a system in which we all end up with exactly the same amount are actually setting us up for a despicable and unjust outcome. Whereas a system in which the ability to earn a higher quality of living is available to you and you have the tools with which to pursue it is a desirable system.
Okay, so let me add something to that.
Sure.
Okay, so it isn't that obvious when you're talking about outcome and when you're talking about right now. I don't mean you, I mean in general. So like you have an array of talents and abilities, and some of those are what you're going to use to pursue your outcome, but some of them are already outcomes. Okay, so it's not obvious what's the difference between an outcome and an ability. Now, you also want to, if everyone was equal, no one could trade because you wouldn't have anything to offer me. You have to offer me something I don't have. Now, you might say the fact that you have something I don't isn't an outcome, but I already said that what exactly constitutes the outcome is blurry. It's arbitrary. Now, all you have to bring to the world is what is unequal about you. And so and you'd think that people who push on the diversity end of things would recognize that above all else. And so by forcing equality, you actually destroy what everyone has to bring to the table to trade. And that's a terrible thing because you punish them then for the best thing they have. That's one terrible thing. But the other thing is you deprive everyone of the opportunity to benefit from everyone bringing what's unique about them to the table. So I would say there's a terrible contradiction between diversity as a value and equality of outcome as a desire. Those two things I don't see how they're logically commensurate.
I would say that the people who tend to promote those systems are the ones that even they recognize that they have nothing to contribute. They aren't producing anything. So they have to take control of the system of, the means of production, because they're not actually part of it. They don't want to put the effort out. They just want to, gain the fruits.